A shy, lonely young man comes back home to settle in with his family. Only this isn't just your average shy, lonely young man. This is Martin. And what you come to ask yourself by the time you finish is Martin really who his family thinks he is? Or is he merely just a freak? I'm Josh Allred,
And I'm Caleb J.
and this is Filmgazm. Hey, everybody. This is a little bit different than what we normally do on the Filmgazm podcast. Not too often do you get Caleb and I just going for our own thing. But I really wanted to talk about this movie and also give a little bit of an overview on the career of of Martin's director, George Romero. So this is Romero's fifth film post Night of the Living Dead in 1977. After the success of Night of the Living Dead in '68, Romero wanted to move away from horror and continue making films about the human condition and the social climate that he was always fascinated and critical of. Those films were There's Always Vanilla in 1971, Season of the Witch or Jack's Wife in '73, The Crazies in '74, and a long thought lost industrial film, The Amusement Park in 1975. As I said, the latter was thought to be lost, but was recently discovered and restored and was screened on Shudder. With only The Crazies having more noticeable horrific elements, these films were a departure from the bleak and terrifying quality of Night of the Living Dead. So, Caleb, have you seen any of the films collectively known as Between Night and Dawn?
I've seen the amusement park when it was on Shudder. I I do like that these supposed to be a departure from his bleak horror films, but god damn it, it's still bleak.
Yeah, it's a I think it might be with the other being Martin, one of Romero's more experimental films, and it was kind of funny that the Lutheran Church was the one who funded the amusement park and allowed Romero to explore ageism and getting old, even in a tumultuous time like the '70s.
Yeah. No, with that all jokes out, the bleakness. It was a really good, especially because like I said, it wasn't really quote unquote a film. It was like funded by almost like a PSA that very obviously you have George Romero, very stylistic choices being made and a lot of his touch. Besides that, I actually haven't seen the other ones. I've seen the remake of The Crazies, which I've enjoyed. I need to see I've been meaning to watch the original one. It's been way up there for me to watch. So yeah, I'm very obviously familiar with George Romero's zombie stuff. It's his outside zombie films that I haven't seen as much of that I need to buff up on considerably.
Yeah, I saw The Crazies again in 2020, like we're right at the height of the pandemic and being quarantined and all of that shit, and it was probably more upsetting and shocking at that moment than it probably ever was to me beforehand. Because it's a big criticism of the government and how the government will just, on a whim, like take over your life. And you really understand that what freedom really is at times an illusion because we do live in a society where there is a government and people always think they're inept or corrupt or both. And I mean, it feels like sometimes that is the case. But yeah, The Crazies really scared the shit out of me because it's also about a virus that gets into the water supply and turns everybody just crazy, for lack of a better word. Um, it was also coming like right before the company that Romero started with Night of the Living Dead was going bankrupt, And for what was to come with Martin, he really wanted to go back to the roots of just working with a few people and just going out and getting something done. So, in order to do that, he had to actually go back even further to his beginnings, because I don't know how many people are aware of it. The reason why Romero is such an accomplished and very technically adept filmmaker is he worked in commercials and industrial films, and being able to turn something around really quickly was an asset if you were going to be doing these kinds of things, because they were always coming out, whether it's for a company or commercials, or in the case of what he was doing just before Martin, sports documentaries with like the Steelers and stuff like that. Mm. What he did was they took short ends of film and other bits of film that they could scrap together, and they used that in order to have the film stock that they would need in order to make Martin. And it was George Romero and the cinematographer of Martin and a frequent collaborator with him, Michael Gornick. And they used all of these bits of film to make Martin, which is pretty impressive if you think about it, that Romero had enough foresight to know that I want to make this film. I know I'm not going to have a lot of money behind me to get the necessary tools that I need. And he was going about it in a way to get that. And there's a lot of, we'll get into it, there's also a lot of stolen shots and a lot of guerrilla filmmaking, and they were just kind of allowed to run free in Braddock when they were shooting Martin. If there's anything that needs to be taken from his impressive 40 plus year career, Romero always had the drive to complete a project by any means necessary. And that was no more evident than the team he put together to make Martin. What did you know about Martin before you actually watched it?
Before I actually watched it, most of my knowledge actually off of Fangoria. I forget which issue, but they had, I know back when I was able to, like, back when they were doing monthly, I convinced my parents or my mom really to let me subscribe to it. There was an issue that talked about it. I forget the issue. It's been so long. In-depth study on it, and I was like, I never heard of this, and I looked more into it, and it always, like, at the time, I think at the time it was like really hard to find the movie way back then. That was when I was in like high school. But it interested me, the idea of like making a film where you question, it's still playing off vampire mythology, but you're questioning the whole time, is he or isn't he? For every symptom he is displaying that is like, yeah, vampire, you know, there's all the other ones where he's displaying no actual like vampirism, you know. So that's how I kind of actually heard about it. Was a Fangoria issue that slips my mind. And then just doing research and being like, okay, this sounds interesting. Again, me foolish as teenager, we had Netflix at the time, so I thought, oh, I'll put it on my thing. That's when I learned the hard way. At the time, it was a bitch to find this movie. Now, luckily, thanks to Second Sight, you know, if you have a region-free player, you can get that and watch it in all its glory. It's a hell of a lot easier to find and watch. But for a first-time watch, it only like I even put it like when I put it on my letterbox, I put like it's like part character study, part horror film, but just all George A. Romero, and it works wonderfully. And it really shows you that like he was so much more than just the guy who gave us Dawn of the Dead, not, you know, zombies, right? As accomplished as, I mean, that's hell of a legacy to have with just those films alone. But to still show that you're more than that, you can do more than that with something like Morin, and obviously I know a lot of other beloved films I haven't seen what people talk about in, you know, Night Riders and The Crazies and things like that. This is a guy that, like you said, he had a vision, he had an idea, he did anything it took to get it done. It's why I look to people like him, Corman, Kaufman, all these guys that, you know, you can say whatever you want about their films, what you think about them. I will always find them more entertaining than like the Oscar Beatty film that they had all the money and time in the war to get done, and there was no real issues other than some actor's ego. Whereas with something like this, it's, you know, they had actual issues. Like you said, they may not have had permits to film somewhere. They may have not. Money is always a big thing with these indie films. The money to film it, so they have to get real creative for how they pull it off. and that drive to do whatever it takes to get it done because you believe in it so much, to me just translates so much more. And you're kind of always like, we talk about all the time, first arts, you're seeing it with like the kind of box office of 2023, right? Where these big back studio films, whether they be horror like Exorcist or your blockbuster films, they're not doing too hot. But when we went to go watch House of Thousand Corpses, even 20 years later, there was a pretty good crowd for that movie. So heart is everything when it comes to these films. And I, like you said, I think that just speaks so much to George A. Romero and his crew and his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more remarkable things about this is the fact that Romero didn't really see any disadvantage to where he was at in Braddock. In fact, he actually used it to his advantage, and Braddock almost kind of becomes a character in and of itself. It's a dying old Rust Belt town. There's not a lot of people there. The people that are there, a lot of them are out of work. They're depressed, and it kind of allows you to actually kind of be more sympathetic to Martin. Like, even though when you first meet him at the beginning of the film, he's murdering a woman. When he comes into Braddock, you're just like, this town is it's dead. And that was an actual thing that was happening to Braddock at the time. And even later on, when Michael Gornick and John Amplis and Tony Buba, they go back to Braddock to do like a little like scene or setting tour of where Martin was shot, it still largely looks the same. Even almost 50 years later, like, this town has not recovered. And Tony was actually very instrumental in having his parents had a house that was actually the house they used in Martin. And in fact, his mom was like the de facto caterer. She made meals for everybody. A lot of the way the house looked was already there. His grandmother was very Catholic, and George just kind of added bits here and there to really kind of hammer home a lot of the Catholic imagery, and using that to characterize Martin's cousin Kuda, and who's brilliantly played by Lincoln Mazel. He was also in the amusement park before that, and he gives a wonderful performance in there. You really kind of see that Romero is very crafty, and he can use things to his advantage, which is very evident in a lot of his other films, especially Dawn of the Dead, being able to use a mall and use it to maximum effect. While it's also a big, sprawling setting, he can also really create these claustrophobic moments of dread and tension, and he really does it well in this. Not only that, this was also the first time that Tom Savini got to work with his friend and mentor. He was a character in it. He also performed a lot of stunts, and he also did the special effects work for Martin, which, if you see him in the documentary about it, he talks about one of the kills in it where Martin drags that guy through the woods and he's setting him up to stab him through the neck or whatever. That was actually the same move he would pull a few years later when he's on Friday the 13th, when he kills Kevin Bacon and he sticks the arrow through reverse. The way he had him set up with the fake upper body, and he had the guy's head sitting in there. That was all already done before in Martin. And it's actually another instance of how Romero collaborates when he makes films. Tom was setting everything up, but the way he had the camera sitting, the camera was more, upright instead of facing downward at the ground, but he had everything composed to where you couldn't tell if it was where the camera was positioned and how it was. Mm-hmm. And George actually walked up, looked at it, and was like, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like, he was like, "No, like, look at the camera." And he saw it and he was like, "Oh, it's brilliant. Like, yeah, let's go for it." Mm-hmm. And that is to his credit as a filmmaker and as a, collaborator, that he trusts these people. Even Tom Savini, this was like one of his very first movies, straight out of theater school, and like had no real basis for what he was going to be doing. And Romero trusted him enough to go and do that kind of stuff. Um, we'll kind of go through the plot a little bit, and we will pick up on things that, at least to me, are worth talking about. Obviously, everybody else is going to have their own points that they want to bring out in this. So, yeah, Martin is the eponymous character played by John Amplis. He's struggling with his sanity and this dubious family history that's being forced upon him by his elderly cousin Kuda, who is extremely Catholic from the old country, which I don't know if it's expressly mentioned, but in one of the essays I read in the book that comes with the Martin set, their family comes from Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
And he once Martin arrives, he like reluctantly provides him room and board alongside his orphan granddaughter Christina, who is played by George's ex-wife Christine Forrest. She was in a lot of his movies after that. They worked together for many, many years. But yeah, this was like one of these moments where George is like finding a lot of the core people that he would work with later on.
Solid connection to our episode that we did on Christine, because that's apparently how the car got named in the book. Stephen King and George Romero, when they were working on, I guess they were at like a party or something together, and he had met his, at that time, wife, Christine Forrest, and so he just named the book Christine.
Damn, I didn't even know that. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, or something like that.
Well, I mean, there you go. Like George Romero, Stephen King. There's always been a good connection there, a really good relationship. Two of the best minds in horror. Yeah, that's actually a really cool. I didn't even know that. That's a nice little fact.
Yeah, it took me a minute because I was like, Connor told me, I'm like, George Romero's wife is Suzanne. And I was like, oh, got it.
Yeah.
So it took. I was like, oh, okay, well, neat little fact. I didn't know. Yeah, they definitely know in the movie at any point say they're from Lithuania. But I also know, I don't know if you want to talk about it now, that apparently I guess there was like a 2.5 hour about-ish cut of this film. And I know George A. Romero, he was very adamant at first about doing black and white, but they had to be like, hey, we don't know if people want to watch that. Whole big thing, so that's why we get the sequences essentially in his head, in black and white, and the rest of the film in color. So I do wonder if maybe in that cut there was more, maybe explanation. I wonder.
I mean, nobody's gonna know because whoever's holding on to that print is not letting it out, from what I remember. Which is fine because I think stylistically it works a lot better when you see these kinds of things, and they remind me of a lot of Universal movies where it's very, very dark and foggy, and all these little things that worked very, very well in films from the 30s and whatnot. And I think it serves as a very distinct line if somebody is watching the movie, that like, hey, this isn't really happening in the real world of the film itself. This is something else. If it's a dream or if it's whatever, or these weird like false memories, because Kuda keeps telling Martin that he's much older than he really is, and it's really interesting with like Martin, because like at times he goes along with the bullshit that Kuda's been feeding him about his lineage and where he comes from and who he really is, but then at the same time he's mocking him. One of my favorite scenes in the film is when he's at dinner and he has that little guillotine, the little mini guillotine, and he sticks the celery in there and he chops it, and he sticks his finger in there and he's looking at Christina, and then he does it and she jumps and giggles, and then he's just like, the trick is pulled. And his line is like one of the coolest, but also like very much like a youthful response to someone who is like beating them with these old like tired ideas. He's just like, there's no magic ever, because Kuda's putting like wreaths of garlic around his door and surrounding him with crucifixes. And
Keeps
Martin's
calling him
just
Nosferatu
yeah,
too.
he doesn't even call him Martin. He just calls him Nosferatu, Nosferatu the whole time, and Martin's just making a joke out of it. But
Mm-hmm.
he also kind of buys into it, which I think plays well throughout the entire film because he even shows up one time with like plastic fangs and all this shit.
Oh, that was cracking me up when he
Yeah,
did that.
but it's like his methods are not at all how people understand vampires.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't bite you and suck your blood. He uses a razor, which is still to me one of the coolest movie posters. He does that, but he also uses sedatives to, render his victims unconscious and do his business. There's actually like a really upfront essay about Martin and the author. I think it's Kat Ellinger. I could be mistaken. I would have to look at the book again. But basically, she calls Martin a freak, rapist, and serial killer. And yeah, I mean he is. But then you also have like this weird sympathy with him. It's it's really it's really interesting how that dynamic is played out, and ultimately it ends very badly and very sadly for Martin. But we'll get there.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like the question about Martin being a vampire or just a really fucked up person. George has his own stance about it. He even said it. He said he's a disturbed man with a disturbed way of doing things. So Romero himself has a very like cut and dry line with how he sees Martin, but he doesn't force the viewer to see it that way. He lets this film play out in front of you, and you can make your own determinations from there.
Well, to me, that's why, in a way, and I know horror films especially love their alternative cuts. There's so many cases of like a drastically different version of the film that exists and what we get. Um, I I'm not. If it ever comes to light, I'm not interested in the longer cut. If it does explain, because I like this very tight hour and a half ambiguity that we're given. I'm with George A. Romero. I think personally, he's just a disturbed dude that has a messed up family that has through years of what his cousin's been saying has made him have false memories. Um, but it is a valid thing if you think he's a vampire as well, because who am I to say you can't play around with the lore in bed and have a vampire that walks around during the day and isn't affected by garlic and stuff like that?
Well, yeah. I mean, other films have kind of played with that as well, and I think being able to both understand the tropes and then break them is is the right way to make like your own vampire movie.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to understand like what the established lore is and like what a vampire's weaknesses are and all of this stuff, it makes it a lot more compelling to me when you can see somebody like Romero, who's very much all about being bold and defiant and very stylized in his films, kind of winking at you, knowing like, yeah, I know about vampires, but you don't know about this kind of vampire. And I really enjoy that. Really enjoy that.
Now the real question is the people who claim they're vampires in real life. What do they think?
Oh, I'm sure they probably don't like Martin. They probably have some kind of bone to pick with it, or have some kind of gripe where there's like, well, actually, that's just it's just not how we do it. Like that's why I have my fangs. And you ever always kind of notice how the ones that have like permanent fangs, they have a lisp a lot of times. You ever notice that?
Yeah, because it's not natural. Not to be that guy. It's not natural.
It ain't natural to look like that. Boy, you need to stop wearing so much black, and boys don't wear eyeliner.
I feel like the inner Texas me just came out in that moment. Like I harnessed an energy I thought was long gone.
Well, guys, you didn't see it, but I almost saw like a cowboy hat like grow out of Caleb's head when he started saying that. I'm pretty sure if he would have gotten a little bit farther into that rant in his his inner Texan came out, probably would have seen a little piece of hay come out. He might have grown spurs from weird places. Like
I tell you what, you don't go out there with your goddamn fangs and your tight pants. It ain't natural, right? Vampires aren't real.
Hey, what do
Unless
we
you
know?
identify as one, it is 2023. So I'm sorry,
It's true. We don't shame here.
you do not.
As long as you're not hurting other people and you have willing, consenting cattle from which you feed on, okay, have fun.
Yeah, I I'm not a part of it, but you do you, boo.
Um, but yeah, so like I think Romero does a really good job of like setting Martin up right at the beginning. He shows him his little kit that he has. He's got his hypodermic needles, he's got his sedatives, he's got his razors, and right then you immediately know that this is not the first time he's done this. This is definitely not the first time he's done this. He's been doing this for a while, and he's got this all down to a science. You know, like very creepily, he is always naked when he does this, and it's if you're thinking about it, like yeah, he's doing this so he doesn't have any blood on his clothes, blah 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 blah. But like, it's it's very it's very well done, and at the same time, like Martin is very unsure of himself, and he has to do things like this because he doesn't have the charm and sophistication of quote unquote classic vampires.
Right.
You know, he can't hypnotize anybody unless you count him playing the mopey sad boy to be his way of hypnotizing
Well,
you and lulling you into a false sense of security.
I mean, it almost worked for the housewife, and until she, we get to that later in the movie. Um, what I like is that yes, he knows what he's doing, but he's still kind of an idiot, and like he can never anticipate human behavior. Oh wow, I've watched way too much Saw in anticipation for the recent Saw film. I just damn near quoted a Jigsaw line. When you anticipate human behavior, which is supposed to explain away like the 5 sequels after the first one. Point is like he doesn't anticipate, or he's not good at anticipating what will happen when he tries to take them down. Because you can see in the opening, like he goes in there real quick, thinking he's going to play out some way. She's in the bathroom, right? And another lady, he goes in there thinking, "I got this." Her fucking lo and behold, not only does he find out that he doesn't have this, she's having an affair because her lover's there.
Yeah, that's actually the dude that he drags in the woods and fucking stabs through the neck. And the weird way is like he does that, but he does it in like a very like almost kind of like curious way, like what's gonna happen when I do this? Because he
Mm-hmm.
knows if he uses a razor, he's gonna get the blood and stuff. But he's like he just kind of stabs him, and then he stabs him a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very uncomfortable and it's very awkward when Martin isn't doing things the way he knows how to do them. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that keeps you like to a point where you're kind of scared of him, but you're also like, I could probably kick his ass.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And
I could save myself. And I mean, he does have some awkward encounters where he almost gets he almost gets caught and he almost gets his ass beat.
to me, it does a really good job of kind of demystifying the vampire as we know it. Because obviously, watching it now, we've had God knows how many takes. I mean, this year alone, we had Renfield and Last Voyage of Demeter in a single year. Um, but back then, 1977, I believe, when this film.
Yeah, it was shot in '76 and released in '77.
Okay, when he came out in 77, you're what, maybe 30, 40 odd years removed from the Universal monsters, right? And not even that long removed from Hammer. So your vampires were Bela Lugosi, who had, like you said, he hypnotized. He was sexy, for lack of a better word. Like that was the thing. He was charming. You believed you could get these people. Christopher Lee famously played him in the Hammer era, right? And again, same concept. There was a monster there, but it was hiding behind the suaveness and debonair um, that you couldn't resist. And so for Martin to come out and say, like, let's just demystify that. Let's give it to the shy, awkward, just he other than like a drunk, depressed housewife, he's not really, you can't see him scoring like these ladies. Like he has to do it this way because he's an awkward dude. And even after this film came out, we quickly went back to charming vampires. I mean, look at the '80s with probably the two biggest examples of Fright Night and The Lost Boys. You wanted to be those vampires. You wanted to be Cherry Dandridge. You wanted to be one of the Lost Boys.
Well, you also had Near Dark, which I
And
think
Near Dark.
was a really good genre mashup, and really showed just how dangerous they
Mm-hmm.
can be. Um, I think like where this film gets interesting is when he does meet Abby Santini, who's played by Elaine Nadeau. She kind of in a way like allows Martin to have a quote unquote normal relationship, and because she needs something, he needs something. They both are kind of like these lost people, and they've somehow found each other. And for a little while, it does like satisfy his, or keep his lust for blood just bubbling under the surface. Um, there's still always the threat that Kuda makes to him. He says, if you kill anybody here, I will stake you through the heart.
Mhm.
Like he makes no bones about it. Like he's very contemptuous with Martin at every turn in this movie. Like there's just always that tension there of like this guy wants to kill him,
Mhm.
even though he's family, and that's why he's helping him have a roof over his head and everything. It's just to keep an eye on him because he thinks he knows what he is. It's not the way that he actually is, but that's just the idea he has built up in his head. That, there's vampirism from the old world that somehow managed to find its way within their family, and it has to be kept in check. Martin has to be watched at all times. And Kuda can't, obviously. He's an old man. He's very much got his head up his own ass when it comes to the religion and being super Catholic and very much like into what the community is doing and things like that. So Martin he's always kind of like this forgotten person. Even though Kuda knows what he is and knows that he's dangerous, he still doesn't manage to keep an eye on him because he is one of those kind of like easily forgettable people. Like there are plenty of shots in this where Martin is just kind of in the background and he's watching somebody, like when he leaves and goes to Pittsburgh and he finds that woman by the grocery store. He's just kind of chilling there, like just watching her, and she's surrounded by some local punks, and he just kind of watches her, and it's really interesting to see that like he can just be like so invisible in this world that like he can't really get along with. He can't really find his place, and he's always there, but you never see him until it's too late. And by that time you do see him and understand what he is, you're already going to be dead.
Yeah. Even the scene when like Tom Strange is first introduced, if you notice, quickly says hi to him, and then Martin gets up and leaves, and they just go on about like, even when he had a moment to kind of be like, hey, this is my cousin, she's being very nice introducing him, like, hey, this is my cousin Martin, blah blah blah. He immediately removes himself from the situation. Like, doesn't take him long to get out of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this kind of tells you that what my question earlier about like real life vampires or those who identify as vampires, they might like this film because if anything, it might just reflect how they feel. We might have latched onto something here, and I'm sticking with my theory.
Also, now you're gonna, moonlight as a vampire hunter.
Oh God, no!
You're telling me?
God, no! That requires work and effort. I don't want to do that.
You heard it here first, vampires of the world. You're safe. Caleb is not coming after you because that's too much work.
Look. It hits night. I get sleepy. I don't want to go out there.
Kind of like you were the first time you watched this.
I don't know what you're talking about. This was my second time watching it all the way through completely. That is on the record.
Yeah, because we all know if it's on the record and it's on the internet, it's true.
That's how the internet works.
Yeah. But like, yeah, so like he leaves, goes to Pittsburgh. He winds up stumbling his way through murdering that dude in the woods. He also kills a couple of drug dealers, almost getting caught by the cops. And then when he comes back to Braddock, he finds out that Mrs. Santini has killed herself. Oddly enough, because I told you before that Tony Bubba's house was, the setting for Martin, Mrs. Santini's house was also Tony Bubba's uncle's house, and Tony Bubba's uncle is Mr. Santini. So, like, it's very much a family affair in this entire movie, and I think if Martin had stayed, it would have ended bad. I think Mrs.
Mm.
Santini was kind of doomed already. But
Um,
sadly for Martin, Kuda does find out that Mrs. Santini is dead, and that pretty much seals Martin's fate. Like he was already doomed. It was gonna happen, but in
mm.
circumstances that were out of his control, he's actually now gonna be marked for death.
Yeah, well, like as like in a weird way, as sweet as like Martin and Miss Santini's relationship is, regardless of the fact that I mean, as sweet as it is two lost souls finding each other. Like I said, a lot of relations like that, they're just always doomed from the start. I mean, at the biggest thing, obviously, is we're saying Mrs. She's married. Eventually, even though he's absent throughout the whole film because he goes on a lot of business trips, I think that's what the excuse was. Um, the guy's going to find out. You know, at one point he's going to find out about this, and that's going to do something. You know, after the first time they finally, you know, give in and do it, she is crying because she reveals she's barren. So she had this emotional baggage she isn't dealing with. If you pay it, and I'm sure you know this, but when you're watching it, you know she's always having a drink. Even when she's having a non-alcoholic drink, you see her spiking it with something constantly. So she's hiding her pain, her grief, her sorrow in a bottle, you know, in booze. So if he wouldn't have found out long enough, eventually the alcohol would rear its ugly head in some way. So it was a relationship that was doomed from the start. It's just, of course, Romero being Romero, he finds the most bleak, nihilistic way to end it with quite a scene. But it serves the point of the film. So, you know, again, you know, I'm joking about that, but it serves the point of the film, which is, you know, now Martin, the one thing he had that could have helped him, like you said, have a more normal life because he's now experiencing a relationship for the first time, and or at least a normal relationship for the first time in his life. It's now taken away from him, you know, because she unfortunately gave in to her own, you know, emotional baggage she was going through, um, and that was doomed from the start. And then, like you said, the fact that you know, I get it, he had no other option that time but to live with his uncle. Then you have the fact that the cousin that did like him, she left. You know, she didn't want to, but she left with her kind of implied not great boyfriend. Um, and he even says in a quick line of dialogue, "She hasn't written to me." So then that's taken from him. And then, like you said, you know, you have an uncle who's so adamant, even though he's smart from sometimes. I might not be normal, but I'm not a vampire, dude. Like I can. Your cross doesn't burn me. Your garlic doesn't do anything to me. Like, but he just won't have it. You know, he's this old guy that one could argue might have his own mental issues if he's so adamant in this belief, whether it's real or not. You know, um, he finds out, and without even looking at the obvious that you know this was clearly a suicide, he immediately goes, "Oh, Martin did it. I gotta kill him." I mean, hell, it makes for a shocking ending. I was not seeing it coming. Well, kind of, because unfortunately, I kind of knew about the ending going into the film, which is sometimes the thing that happens with these much older films. Um, you can't always escape it when it's older films. Um, but it makes for a hell of a shocking ending because you do not see it. You're just like, oh man, how can this get any worse? And Romero's just like, hold my beer, I'll show you, and just does the fucking stake through the heart. And you're like, oh, god damn it.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty violent death. It's definitely for me like it's the most violent death in the film, and maybe it's poetic that it happens to Martin. Out of all the people that the lives that he's taken, his death is going to be the most brutal. And even though you said like you knew it happened, you were still taken aback by it. I think that says enough of how well of a filmmaker Romero is that you can know what's coming, but seeing it is something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like with these little things that you said, like he's dropping through either in bits of dialogue or stuff that he's showing you, it's all done in a way that's not beating you over the head with what's coming. He's not like grabbing you by the fucking ears and going like, did you see what I just said? Did you see what this, like you're taking all of this in and you're observing it. And even though this doesn't have, the best production value, and the staging of it can feel sometimes like it's almost like a play and whatnot, like it's also kind of got like a documentary type feel to it, and maybe that has something to do with the film stock they were saving for the films that they were making, that it kind of lends itself to that kind of thing. I mean, Tony Buba also had a documentary background as well. He was doing stuff in and around Braddock. So I think with those kinds of histories with Tony Buba, George Romero, that was always kind of going to get into the final film in some way. But Romero is adept enough to be able to suck you into this story. And one of the things that somebody mentioned in the book, and I'm cribbing it, and I apologize that I'm not giving you the proper due. But somebody even put it, like you said, it was a character study. It's kind of like it's one of his bleakest movies. Not as bleak as fucking Day of the Dead. I don't know anybody could get any darker than that. But it's a character piece that's kind of like it's kind of like Taxi Driver in a way. Mm-hmm. Like you're going along with this one character throughout the entire thing, and more or less experiencing the world through his eyes and how the world interacts with him. So you kind of reluctantly sympathize with him at points. Like you're definitely horrified by the things that he does, and when he goes out and kills people, like you're just it's disgusting and it's upsetting. I mean, you also feel kind of bad for him because he does want to feel like he's connected to people, and he's even mocked through his conversations on the radio, with calling into the DJ and talking to him. Like they call him the Count, and they think he's just fucking blowing smoke up their ass. A lot of times they're just making fun of what he's doing, but he's using it as a means, ironically enough, of confession. He's being completely honest with the things that he does, the things that he feels, and he's using that anonymity like you would with a priest to confess the things that he's done, but nobody believes him.
Right. And what I think is really interesting with that, he confesses in a way to the radio, but then when his crazy fucking cousin Kuda goes to an actual priest, they believe him. He doesn't talk to the priest, doesn't try to explain anything to him, just, again, tries to get the fuck out of there. And it's kind of looking at him like, what are you doing?
Yeah. And actually, if you are very eagle-eyed, which shouldn't be, even though most people have a certain image of George Romero when they picture him in their head, obviously with the iconic glasses that I have a print of from Gary Pullen. That was a Christmas present from you and our friend Kyle. Still one of the best Christmas presents I've ever gotten.
You're welcome. I'm pretty good at what I do. I'm a good friend.
I literally told you what I wanted.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But yeah, George Romero does actually play a priest in this. He's also in the amusement park, but he's very young, and he's he kind of plays like this like swinging 70s priest, like he's sitting there drinking wine and smoking cigarettes and all this other cool shit. But like going back to it, like yes, Martin is a sad movie about a sad person, and there are some very, very shocking moments. But ultimately, for me, and I'm sure you're in the same boat from what we said before, he is just a fucked up kid with a fucked up sense of reality, and he has to try and fight the history that was imposed on him. And somebody telling him, no, this is what you are, and he's like, no, that's not what I am, because none of that's real, and he mocks it and everything, but that is ultimately how he's judged, and he's staked through the heart very violently, and then unceremoniously buried in the backyard with a crucifix stabbed right on top of him.
Yeah.
And like that's just how it ends. Like that's just it. It's just like boom, Martin's in the ground, it's dead. End of story. And it's so abrupt and you kind of don't really have a very good resolution. I mean, there is a resolution, obviously. Martin's dead, but you're still just like, fuck me, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I did kind of feel bad by the end. I was like, fuck, man. Like, this guy literally has nobody. The one person who is family only wants to kill him. He cannot connect to anyone. And I mean, that's something that personally I struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's partly why I do find so much in Martin to that resonates with me. So yeah, I mean, this film, like you said, was largely hard to come by for a very, very, very long time. There are DVDs you could find on like eBay for ridiculous prices. And as they did with Dawn of the Dead, Second Sight came through and they put the time in to restore it from the elements that they were able to get their hands on, and they've got a nice book of essays in there. I encourage anybody, if you can get this. I don't think this version of it is available, but at least do yourself the favor and get this film. Like, George Romero is always going to be known for zombie movies, always, and I'm sure he would be fine with that. He didn't always want to be known as that, but he kind of had like this Orson Welles kind of approach to things where like he wanted to be a filmmaker and tell stories, but he was also not afraid to work within the genre to make the movies that he wanted to make. Like, George Romero made horror movies, but he made his kind of horror movies. Mm-hmm. He never followed trends. He was always striking out on his own. And with a lot of these films, he's saying things that even now, especially with the case of Dawn of the Dead 45 years later, they're still relevant. Mm-hmm. And you can't say that for many directors, and especially with a lot of media that comes out now, it's very disposable. Once you're done, it's out of your head and you're not thinking about it anymore. Yeah. And I think somebody with Romero's capabilities and the way he made his art, which we're going to kind of touch on as we go through and talk about Romero's career and kind of discuss his filmography.
One thing I do want to point out on the note of like his social commentary and stuff, because we actually haven't really dug into that too much yet. I'm sure we will when we talk about his career and stuff. Because, obviously that's very relevant with his zombie films. Everyone knows that his zombie films have social commentary. It's one of the things that have always made them stood out. I'd argue you even see it still in his non-horror stuff, from what I've seen at least. It's just his way of style. And one thing you mentioned that like made me really connect to the film was when you said like Martin has no one, right? There's this preconceived notion of him, right? And he only had the two people that connected to him. One had to leave, one killed herself, and it's a small town, like he said. Kind of going back to on this, ladies and gentlemen, going back to my Texas roots. I grew up in a small Texas town, and it's like that with a lot of small towns across America. Whether it's because of your siblings or your parents or whoever the hell else in your family lives in that town, if they did something, people have that preconceived notion on you. Or if you did something, God bless, that's what you're known for until you get the fuck out of that town, or you, in Warren's case, you die, and then it's finally gone. So that's when I connect to this idea of like, growing up, I didn't have any luckily preconceived notions, but I also got the fuck out of my small town when I graduated high school. So I didn't really stick around long enough to have people think of me in a certain way before I got out.
What would they think about you now?
They'd be just sad, depressed, and horrified. And it hits. It's something that it does. As much as I have in all seriousness fond memories of my growing up in that town, I want to go back, right? And it's because like I don't want to. That is a negative to that living. It's everyone knows everyone. You have your people like Cuda, who everyone knows in town because he runs the one meat shop, I'm sure, in the entire town probably. And because of that, people have these notions. All it takes, because of his standing, is to say something about Martin, or in his case, Nosferatu, and no one gives a shit about who he is as a person. They just go, yeah, he's he's so this, and this. Now, granted, in this case, Martin is has issues, but you've seen that happen in a lot of small towns where just because someone didn't like someone, they if they have a better standing than they get, other person gets shit on.
Yeah, I mean, I also grew up in a small town. Like, my high school was surrounded by farmland.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the season, it was either corn or tobacco. That was my view out the window. Um, and that is another facet of this that I did resonate with. Like, going back home is kind of it's kind of sad and it's awkward. Um, I don't really keep up with a lot of people that I grew up with, um, mostly because I didn't have a lot of friends. So, like, the people that the inevitable people that rush and make friends with you on Facebook because they went to high school with you and shit like that. It's To me, it's laughable because I'm like, you didn't like me before. Like, why all of a sudden are you trying to reach out to me now? I mean, I'm largely the same person I was then. So, what's the fucking problem? Or what was the
Mm-hmm.
problem? Um, it's almost the reverse of what Martin goes back to, because where I grew up, it's there's a lot of building up that Wilmington has had over the years, and it hasn't been good in my opinion. A lot of the things that made it unique and, to me, home is largely gone, all for the sake of quote unquote progress and attracting more tourists to town and things like that, which I never cared for because it just crowded my town during
Mm-hmm.
summertime and during certain festival times and things like that. And you're just kind of like packing this area with more and more people, and there isn't enough infrastructure to kind of handle that. But the people that are making the money off of it, they don't give a shit because they're just making money. And you still have these pockets of, poor areas. And there's a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of it everywhere. It's a very common, um, it's a very common theme across America, and I'm certainly not the only one that has experienced that kind of thing. And it's really fascinating that Romero can take something like that, something that's already existing, and allow it to be injected into his film and make it still very relevant, especially if you've had that kind of experience. You immediately attach it. Um, it's kind of like the small town thing, like when Martin is walking around town and like you see this little marching band parade or whatever going on. That goes back to being able to steal shots and get whatever. They're pretty much
Mm-hmm.
allowed to run riot and do whatever they wanted to in Braddock, and they just told John Amplis to walk through, and they were filming it, and they just got away with it. But they were able to use it to their advantage, and that was why Kuda had the name that he had, because that was the name of the business. So they just like, all right, well, we can't, it's going to cost too much money to change the sign. So that's just going to be fucking Lincoln Mozell's name. Name's going to be Kuda. And
Yeah.
it was all done in service to the actual finished film, which is what you do with a lot of independent films. Is you work with what you have, and if you can't change the name on a building, you just use it to your advantage. Or if you have a friend who lives there and they're like, yeah, my parents said we could use my house, and they're like, fuck yeah, you use the house. You add what you can, because you don't have a lot of money to dress up a set, but the house works for you, or you make it work. And it's it's amazing to me that like a film like this that could have just been forgotten is coming back again and is getting the appreciation, to me, that I think it deserves. And it's only another feather in Romero's cap, to me at least, to show that he had a lot more diversity in his filmmaking toolbox to make movies and make different kinds of movies. And you don't you don't see that often with filmmakers. Like, a lot of them just kind of stay in the lane that they're in, and they don't really branch out. Romero was very much all about challenging himself and working in different ways. I mean, the only thing that never worked out for him was when he made anything in collaboration with a studio.
Mm.
There are a few famous examples of that, like when he made The Dark Half, when you had Land of the Dead, which to me in the ranking of you know his zombie movies is probably the third best. Um, because I just don't know how much like Diary and Survival are like ones that I go back to that often.
Mm.
But like that was the one that I got to see in a theater. It was like a new George Romero movie, and you're like, holy shit, like I gotta fucking see this. But like even The Dark Half doesn't really feel like a George Romero movie. Um, Creepshow doesn't really feel like a George Romero movie, but I think it's because he embraced the medium that he was working with, and kind of showing another side of himself. So I think in that regard, like, yeah, it is a Romero movie. Like it's playful. It's got like a real dark sense of humor.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, he's also working with a friend of his in Stephen King to make something. I mean, in any interview you see with Romero, he talks a lot about like growing up reading EC comics and that kind of thing. And I think he he found a way to really make something again that has lasted. I mean, the fact that it's gotten a 4K fucking release. There's a whole documentary about the making of it.
A
Like,
TV show, the comics. There's now a comic run of it.
right, like all of these things like are just a testament to what he was able to do with something that's that itself is like 40 years old, some shit like that. It's all of these movies. Like, if you want to talk about like another movie that is very much a Romero movie and might be one of his most personal ones, is Night Riders. Um, Even if you haven't seen it, like it's basically his statement against the mainstream and the people who are in this, like, basically like it's medieval times with motorcycles is the best way to like really like narrow it down.
Mhm.
They operate well outside of the norm. Like even in their day to day lives, it's very much kind of like a communal living situation, and they are targets for that. Every town they go to, the police don't like them, and they're always like getting harassed, and they kind of just have to pick up and move. And um, it's a really good movie. It kind of shows like what happens to somebody when they come from a very like humble, hardworking beginning, and then get a taste of fame, and then they feel like they're bigger and better than what they came from, and how that affects them. Because that's the arc that Tom Savini's character Morgan has. And ladies, if you've never seen it, you're going to see a lot of Savini in there. He gives you some good cuts of beef in there. I'll tell you that much. But it's easily for me his most personal film, because like, he is very much like talking about how he feels about being the filmmaker that he is, and not ever getting any recognition for it. Not that he ever made movies to get that kind of recognition. He just wanted to tell stories, but it was always like the mainstream was just like never giving him any recognition until well after he passed, which is fucking travesty in my opinion. And I'm glad that Suzanne is able to continue that with the George A. Romero Foundation, or GARF as it's known. It was able to get The Living Dead finally finished,
Which was a great book.
yeah. Oh man, I read that on my deployment.
Hey, same.
And it was something that I'd always been meaning to read, and I just never could get into doing it. And then finally, when I just had nothing else to do, and I forced myself to read it, ironically enough, there's a section of it that I was like, oh shit, like this is very triggering, very near to me in my experience.
I wasn't on the said name of the platform, but I was on the type of platform, and I was just like, son of a bitch.
Yeah.
No, I know you. That's
no,
how I met.
were,
But
yeah.
I just read it as I was still there, and I was like, "Oh man."
Yeah, it makes you wonder. I had like very vivid images in my head reading those sections, and I was like, fuck, like, this is just too much. And I could
Yeah.
really visualize, and I think that speaks to like what Romero was writing and how Daniel Krauss
Mhm.
was able to get it over the finish line.
Yeah. If I
Um,
recall correctly, the ranks weren't always correct, but I forgave it.
no, there are a lot of those little nitpicky things about it, but I forgave it because I was very engaged with the story, and I had a personal laugh at it because it's just like, yeah, that doesn't happen. No, that doesn't happen. No,
Mm.
you'd never see that kind of guy out there because they don't get out of their office. That's
Yeah.
why they're fat and fucking stupid.
Yeah.
We'll just say that those opinions are of my own and not necessarily reflective of any other official stance about the military. Don't come at me. Um,
I do.
okay, so like after this, we have Dawn of the Dead. We
Mhm.
talked long and could talk even more about how wonderful that
Long
movie is.
and
40.
hard and into the
You
night.
really couldn't leave that, could you?
It
You
was
just
in
had
my
to.
head. I also want to quickly, on a quick aside.
I swear, if this goes anywhere dark, Connor, you have my permission to edit it out.
Nothing will be edited out here. I had a quick side. I actually had to go with the whole high school thing with the Facebook thing. I have hit my first milestone as I get older, and it's been 10 years since my high school graduation. And they sent out the whole thing on Facebook, like, "Who wants to come to the 10-year reunion?" Blah blah. Blah. I got so many messages, and all I could think was like, "None of you gave two shits about me in high school. I don't care about you. I'm not coming to this thing." And I didn't, and that's my aside. And now we can go back to talking about a long, hard night of Dawn of the Dead.
Please edit that out, Connor. Anyway,
Nope.
um, yeah, no, I enjoyed like saying will not be attending my own at 10 and 20 years because I'm old.
Yeah, I
Um,
was very happy to hit 1 out of 10.
yeah, so like yeah, we had Dawn of the Dead in '78. That movie is probably Romero's most famous outside of Night of the Living Dead.
Mm-hmm.
I talked about Night Riders. I encourage anybody who hasn't seen it to get it. Get your eyeballs on it. It's great. It's a long movie. Like it's probably his most like you and I think at times it kind of drags it a little bit too long, but
Does
it's a really good movie, and I think everybody should check it out because
does
it gives you a really good rounding of Romero's capabilities as a storyteller. Like he's not just a horror guy. He
Mhm.
really goes all over the place. And I mean, Ed Harris is in it, so like,
Oh, that's enough for me already.
yeah,
Is it still out by Shout? I believe was the ones that put it out.
probably.
I know.
Yes,
I know him and like well his non. Actually, they have a lot of his zombie stuff. His non-zombie stuff. Him and Carpenter, they have plentiful, fucking, uh, Blu-rays on. So if there's two directors you want to get like good copies of their movies, Carpenter and George Romero, go to Shout Factory.
yeah. So then Creepshow is great anthology. He comes back again with Day of the Dead, which did have interference from the producers. Not necessarily, it wasn't really a studio movie per se, but that
And it wasn't a huge hit when I came out. I
no,
believe
no.
it was like reappraised like years
Yeah,
later.
yeah, because like that was supposed to be like his epic conclusion to his trilogy of zombie movies, and the budget got hacked just before production, so Romero had to like quickly change gears. But what is there now, and everybody knows as Day of the Dead, is an amazing movie. It does for me like kind of wrap everything up. He does go beyond that, obviously, with Land of the Dead later on.
Mhm.
Then you've
So-
got Creepshow 2, which he was more producer than like full on director. I don't know. He might have directed that too. Um, but then Monkey Shines, which I caught once when I was a kid, and I didn't know about him being the director of it for a long time. And then when I did find it out later on, I was like, holy shit! Like it's actually a really good movie, and it is a good movie. It's also talking about some interesting concepts with like you know being a paralyzed person and how you can you know try to be self-sufficient, but it's also like this interesting relationship between man and animal, and how that can, has its own dark side to it. It's also talking a lot about like I think animal testing and things like that. He also did another anthology with Dario Argento called Two Evil Eyes, which are them doing Poe stories. So yeah, if you've never seen that, I highly encourage you to get that. Blue Underground put that out. Then he rewrote and had Tom Savini direct a remake of Night of the Living Dead, which I really like. It has Tony Todd in it.
It has a
Patricia Tallman.
Say it's a pretty stacked cast in it.
Yeah,
when I looked it up.
Yeah, you've got some interesting characters, and there's some really good special effects and zombie design, and it was a way for Romero to kind of, I don't want to say like right the wrongs of his original version, but
do you think he would have done differently?
It does make Barbara more of an impactful character. She does kind of have more of an arc than she did in the original one, where she just basically becomes catatonic and does nothing. But I think the other elements of that film that are really like hitting you hard in the face work so well that you kind of, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but you kind of just forget about Barbara. She's kind of just a way to get into the story. But I do like how kind of like you were able to take like the strong women that have come through horror movies up to that point, especially Sigourney Weaver and Alien and things like that. Then you have Patricia Tallman doing her literal transformation from this, librarian looking sister in the beginning to by the end of it, she's in pants and strapped with rifles, and she's like taking charge in the movie.
And wasn't this another one? Because I think the reason I haven't seen this was, if I recall correctly, this was another one that was really hard to find for the longest time. And I think it's been more recently getting a lot easier to find.
It existed on DVD for a long time. It didn't really get a Blu-ray until a few years ago. I haven't upgraded mine to a Blu-ray. I still have the DVD of it. And yeah, it's good. I like it. I actually saw that one before I saw the original Night of the Living Dead. And it was funny because when I was watching it, my mom was asking me, like, what are you watching? I'm like, Night of the Living Dead. She was like, that's not Night of the Living Dead. Because she only knew the 68 one. And she actually sat and watched it with me, and she was like, oh, God, this is terrifying.
I've heard some people even say they prefer it to the original. I've heard that from quite a bit of people.
I mean, I can see where people would like that. I mean, it is a more modern movie. It's literally the same movie, though. Like there are small differences in like the fate of Ben, like what happens to him, and the main conflict is more between Barbara and Cooper. Tom Tolles fucking great in that. Oh my God, he's so good. And a lot of that, it wasn't planned to have like that race conflict in the original Night of the Living Dead. It just came up because of who Dwayne Jones was, and that became like the actual like center of it. And and in a way, like it was an unintentional consequence of casting Dwayne Jones. It became like a lot more relevant. I mean, even up to the night it was going to come out in theaters with Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated, like that made that movie that much more culturally impactful.
It kills me. It's like when people come, because it's like between that and like people telling me that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is real. I'm like, no, it's fucking not. When people are like, Romero did that on purpose. I'm like, no, he casted him because he liked him.
He was the best actor.
Yeah, he was the best actor, and it literally was just like all the events just line up to make that so much more impactful, so much more. And now I'm not saying you can't take that, like it's not something that you should be applying to the film, but obviously it's something that, thanks to a lot of events that have happened by circumstance, it is something that, like you said, people have been able to draw from and make the film even that much, an already good film, that much better for people, because it's doing things that just weren't seen at that time. And
Yeah.
if anything, to me, it really speaks to George Romero at the time, and he easily could be like, I don't want that guy in my movie because of his, skin color, because it was it was still the 1960s. Let's be honest. Um, but it speaks to him to say like, I don't care. The guy's a good actor.
Well, and I think
He's
that more than anything shows once again that even from the very beginning, Romero was always looking for the best people to work with. Period. It didn't matter to him who you were, where you came from, as long as you were there to show up, work hard, and be a part of the project. That's all that mattered to him. And he always famously said Dwayne Jones was the best actor out of everybody there. A
Mhm.
lot of people were just there because they put up money for it, and it was like the producer's wife or some shit. Like I think Carl Hardman, who was Cooper in that, he was one of the producers. He was part of like the original setup of the company and everything. Like he put up money, and they were just like, oh, well, I mean, we need somebody, so can you do this? And he did it. And I think to have a lot of like almost non-actors in that lends more to the realism of it with what you see in that film. Um, and as things have not gotten, I would say, better in the fucking over 50 years since that movie's come out, it it only cements that film's legacy as being a very real, to a certain extent, way that things would play out in that kind of catastrophic scenario.
Mhm.
And you even have those moments in the 1990 version. Actually, so like in one of my early film classes, we talked about like framing and how you like set up shots to like characterize or like subvert the audience's expectation and stuff. And that first moment where Barbara meets Ben, and he gets out of the truck and he's got the crowbar or whatever in his hand, and in the framing of it, Tony Todd is right at the very front of the frame, and he's huge, and he's got the crowbar, and you're just like, oh shit, what's about to happen? And Barbara is literally framed inside of his legs where the triangle of open space is, and she's framed in there. She's very tiny, and she's scared because this is right at the beginning of things where she has no idea what the hell's going on. And just that image is used as reference for like how you can create a very meaningful image and say absolutely nothing, but you as the viewer can infer something like, well, that guy's clearly gonna fucking hurt her, but it winds up being the moment that you're introduced to one of the other heroes of the story. And Ben in that version, there is a lot of that unspoken racism in there, and Tom Tolles is very, very good about like getting to that point where you think he's going to say something that's going to get his ass beat, but he doesn't. And you also see that he's not as tough as he thinks he is, and that Ben is not going to back down to him, especially in this moment where everything relies on people working together. He's not going to tolerate somebody who doesn't want to work towards the same goal that he wants to work towards. And it's almost kind of like a way of like wiping the slate clean of everything that's happened before that moment. And it's like, no, this is how things are going to go now. There's even that line, he's like, if you want to be a boss down there, he's like, I'm boss up here. Almost telling him like, if you don't want to be here in this, this new world that's happening right now, you can go back down to the basement where you belong and
Mhm.
deal with things down there. He's like, 'cause I'm not putting up with it. And that's one of the things that really stands out in that movie. And still, the fact that it was 1990, that's
Mhm.
33 years ago, and you're still having these moments of racial tension that haven't gone away, in a lot of cases have gotten worse, and it's still there.
Mhm.
And that's why these films are still amazingly impactful.
I'll say I think as we're seeing, without I obviously it's on political podcast, but like as we're seeing on the news nowadays with certain politicians, certain former presidents, um, and a lot of things, unfortunately, not a lot of these beliefs that people have held on to for so long have gone away. For every good person that essentially isn't racist, couldn't give 2 shits less, they just are like, you know, been, played by Tony Todd and Dwayne Jones respectively, that are like, we just need to do what we need to demand together and do this thing. We have people like that. Yes, they exist, thankfully, but unfortunately, the large, as we're kind of, especially on social media, large majority we see, especially on social media and the news and stuff, is the people that are just so adamant about, and as they like to say, going back to the good old days, um, which is the most like, if thinly veiled, like, let's go back to like when basically white people were in charge of everything. White straight men, I should be like very specific with what they want. Um, that's always what that statement has always like meant, and the fact that that is still a thing, still a serious issue. Certain laws, as we're seeing, and with women's reproductive rights, still being obviously a very big issue. It is, yeah, these films, and that to me is why, and it's kind of like the point with this. I think George Romero's social commentary works so well, and why I say like you can have bad social commentary and good, and what I mean by that is you have something like what I kind of famously, I think, on one of these back when we had Beyond the Bad, with the most recent Black Christmas remake, that was bad to me. Bad form of trying to get your message across, because you weren't really being subtle. You're just hitting over the head, and you're doing what I call blanket statement. You're not being nuanced about it. You're just saying, in that case, all men are bad. Fuck them. Well, it's a little more nuanced than that. Romero was not blanket statement. He was nuanced. He was like actually giving you something that, like you said, because of it resonates to this very day, 40, 50, however many years later.
Well, I would counter that in a way that like he very much has a side that he's on, and that's very much shown in like how bad his villains are, the ones that are
Mm-hmm.
like the more villainous characters in there. He very much has a stance against certain kinds of people and um, certain things that he wants to speak out against, like to kind of keep going through the rest of the films that he has. Like with the Dark Half, there wasn't anything necessarily political about it, but that was a very close collaboration again with Stephen King. But that film got fucked with by the studio, and I think that was um, the last like true studio film that he made. Land of the Dead, I think, was released by Universal.
I think he had free reign on that movie though.
Yeah, but he pretty much could do whatever he wanted to. He
Yeah.
made another one after that that not a lot of people have seen called Bruiser, and that's a very interesting look at like identity and kind of again being like an anonymous person and fighting to be seen, but then also kind of embracing your anonymity to accomplish your darkest desires. It's a very interesting movie, and also features a incredibly horned up Peter Stormare. If you've never seen it, again, add it to your list of Romero movies to check out. We talked about Land of the Dead quite a few times. That's most famous for me, at least, of being like this really like blatant criticism of the post 9/11 George Bush presidency, and it's very well, very well personified by Dennis Hopper's character in that, and just it's a very much like a class war kind of movie, and very stark in how it's like the haves versus the have-nots, and that people are only going to lay down for so long before they won't take the status quo anymore, and that is also like ironically enough where the people who live in the slums um, are on the same side as the zombies who are coming for the very pristine and very opulent Fiddler's Green. And then Romero goes back again to the Night of the Living Dead story to kind of make his own kind of hybrid found footage movie in Diary of the Dead, which was another one I got to see in a theater. Um, and again, it's not one that I always go back to. I've seen it here and there. it has its moments, and I think like when it's really playing on the hysteria of that first day, night, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
of of the zombie apocalypse, it works really well. Um,
Yeah,
some of the other parts just don't work for me. Um,
I
but again, it's Romero like taking swings,
mm,
and if nothing else, I have to give him credit for looking at something that was very like new and relevant at the time, even though found footage movies existed long before then, and they were very much like in the mainstream, and he was able to kind of take a swing with it.
because I
Um,
believe he did that right when the boom was happening with Paranormal Activity. Um, I believe I could be wrong on that. But I do remember watching. I have seen that one, Diary of the Dead, and I remember thinking it was fine. Like like you, there's things I liked in the movie. I was very intrigued by that. I was like, ooh, okay, Romero doing found footage zombie film. I'll check that out. Um, but then there was just a lot that didn't really work all that well for me. I do remember not really liking like any of the characters in the movie that are our main characters. Um, but I yeah, I don't go back to it quite like because I can go back to from Night to Land. I can go back to any of those anytime. I actually really do enjoy Land. Um, but yeah, I haven't gone back to Diary. I think honestly, minus the one time I've seen it.
yeah, I've seen it a couple of times after. The only one I haven't gone back to was Survival of the Dead, and that was another one. Got really excited about it. You know, it's another Romero movie, um, and unfortunately, that was like his last feature that he made. Um, and I think we do miss his voice in his movies, especially now. Um, I can only imagine the kinds of things that he would be making again if he was, you know, still given decent budgets to work with. That was something he always wasn't wasn't very shy about mentioning. Um, even though like a company like Capcom like took beats from his films to make Resident Evil, and then he almost had his own Resident Evil movie. Um, from what I can gather from bits of the script that I've read and people talking about it, like he was able to find the really like cinematic points of the game and incorporate them into a story that was very faithful to what the original game was. And then even some of those things that he wrote in his original script, he actually like got
Mm.
uh, through all the way to the finished product. Like that whole scene where they're in the laser room, that was in his script.
I didn't know that.
Yep, that was in his script, and they kept it in there. Um, but as far as anything else, I'm not sure. His was more contained. Wasn't, you know, with the whole AI thing like causing the outbreak. His was more, you know, like Romero always liked to criticize society. One of my often used expressions is that he was always holding up a mirror to society and forcing us to look at ourselves.
Mm.
And he was he was never really critical of like humanity. It was more just like, look at what we're doing. We can be so much better than this. But this is what I see us as right now.
Mm.
And the fact that a lot of these things that he's talked about haven't gone away, and it's still like it's still able to say something now. I think we do miss a filmmaker like him.
Mm.
And it was something to read The Living Dead and know that this was stuff that he had been writing for years,
Mhm.
and a lot of it still felt
I'll say they did
relevant.
this, and to me, I don't know about you, but that book, they did a good job of you not knowing when it wasn't Romero's part of the books that he hadn't written yet, and the parts they did a very good job of it still being his voice up to the damn bleak nihilistic ending of the book. Um, I and quick aside, I will say why I would love to see what George Romero were done with a Resident Evil film. I the first one's kind of a guilty pleasure for me. First film.
Everybody
Um,
has them.
yeah. I am curious because I know you saw the announcement that with that, and this is a great segue to what you'd mentioned, Living Dead. what are you thinking with the Twilight of the Dead? Because they're essentially going to be doing the same thing they did with the book, just on a movie form, which is still bring his voice to essentially the final Dead film he was, I believe, already working on. Um, and getting it made. And I know Suzanne's very involved with it as well, like she was with the book. So I'm very curious, like what are you thinking with this? Do you think we'll get a good film, at least a good posthumous release to sit on, or what are your thoughts here?
I think it's hard without actually seeing the movie to have really concrete thoughts about it, other than it would be nice that something that he worked on is going to be carried through. I think if the right people are involved, and having Suzanne on board and kind of overseeing things is a good sign. I think just it has to have the right people. It has to have the right people who don't want to make this for themselves, and they really are. They've listened and read George's words and understand his attitude and what they can do with that. It's like I said, it's very hard, and if it comes out, I'll absolutely go see it, just to make sure that you know I've once again been able to go to a theater and see a movie that has his name on it.
Mm-hmm. I and I only ask because I know you've been mentioning. Obviously, it's very he's very much missed his voice, and I think what has me in a way kind of like, again, this is, I know obviously with the strikes we're kind of standstill, or strike I should say now with the actors, we're at a standstill with how much I think they got an interim agreement on this movie. Excuse me. Um, why obviously we know it won't be like quote unquote his true voice, because this is done years after his passing. It will be nice if, like you said, they get the right people involved. Obviously, Suzanne kind of spearheading this is off to a great start, and they do write by him and study very deeply what made his voice and what made his stuff work. It will be very satisfying to have like a posthumous final stamp from Beyond the Grave, um, you know, voice from George A. Romero in a way.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good spot to end this. That's all we've got for this episode of Filmgazm. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I refuse to call it by the other name. At Filmgazm or Filmgazm Productions. You can find me on Twitter at Zombie Killer. Caleb is also there as Scary Caleb 92. It's so you. It's so you. It's.
I made it in college, and I don't really use it all that much.
Yeah, he's there. Taunt him, harass him, or just be nice to him. Whatever you want to do. But yeah, that's it. Until next time, be careful who you meet on the streets. It might just be a vampire waiting for the right opportunity to drain you. Stay scared.